Thanks for tuning in to another special episode of the podcast. I'm Rob Meyerson, your host. Except that, like last time, on this episode, I'll play the role of guest instead of host. Ilya of Studeo, a Brisbane, Australia-based design and branding studio, asked me to join him on Instagram Live to talk about branding and naming. Ilya is a versatile designer and brand consultant with about 20 years of experience building and growing brands. You can find him on Instagram at We Are Studeo. That's Studeo. One of the cool things about doing this on Instagram Live is that people were watching, commenting, and asking questions in real time, which you'll hear Ilya reference occasionally throughout the conversation. If you're interested, you can watch the video of the conversation on Ilya's IGTV, that's at We Are Studeo, or on the How Brands Are Built YouTube account. But for audio only, you've come to the right place. Here's my full conversation with Ilya. Hey, Ilya, how are you?
Hi, good day, Rob. I'm well. How are you?
Great, thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
That's my pleasure. I came across your. I think we connected on Instagram some time ago, but I really kind of came across your work and your background through Jacob's podcast, where you talked about brand strategy and naming. So. I thought it would be. I have a serious passion for naming. I'm nowhere near kind of. Obviously, I haven't worked with the larger organizations. My clients were mostly startups and kind of small to medium businesses that maybe were looking to get repositioned, or new businesses starting where we had to come up with a name for them, or sometimes name a product line for them or something like that. Mm-hmm. But you've got. I think, obviously a very broad experience working with large organizations. So I know you worked at some of the larger branding companies like Interbrand. And I do know that you've done some work also for HP, if I understand correctly. If you've done some, I'm not quite sure the extent of your work. So maybe if you could give the people listening a bit of a breakdown of kind of your experiences.
Yeah, I've been doing branding work for about 15 years, mostly on the agency side and mostly, well, a lot of it at big agencies, like you mentioned, Interbrand, Siegel and Gale, Future Brand are probably some of the ones that people might have heard of. I've also worked at smaller agencies. So I lived in Asia for a while, and in Shanghai, I worked for a firm called Lab Brand, which happens to be one of the best Chinese brand naming agencies out there. I don't speak Chinese very well, so I didn't get to do a lot of Chinese brand naming, but coincidentally, that's one of their areas of expertise. But around 2012, I think, I was at Interbrand. HP was a client, and HP had an opening for a head of naming on their brand strategy team and asked me if I would take that role. So I did that for a couple of years. I headed up naming and brand architecture there. And then shortly after the company split, HP split up into two separate companies. Now it's the old HP that you recognize with the blue circle logo, and now it's Hewlett Packard Enterprise is the other company.
All right. Yep.
So after that, I was there when that split happened, which was really fascinating, although a bit traumatic.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. And so I left, came out of that and started my own agency called Heirloom, where I do a lot of brand strategy and naming work. And not unlike you, I have plenty of clients who are small or SMB types of businesses, but I also still, because of my background and some of the relationships I built, have clients that are in the Fortune 500 as well. And for them, I'm obviously not renaming companies all that often, but naming products and services and things like that.
Nice. Yeah, you've traveled quite a bit. It's very interesting that. How did you go with the Chinese kind of market? I know that you weren't naming, Chinese brands, I guess necessarily, but I suppose they were looking for someone that would come in from obviously a different backgrounds that maybe they were trying to target like kind of Western markets. So
that's right.
What was your experience? How did you find that in general working?
Yeah, I moved there in about 2009. So right when the American economy was sort of cratering after the financial fallout of 2008. and China was doing quite well. So it was a pretty exciting place to be to see that economy blowing up in 2009. And honestly, that's a big part of why my wife and I decided to move there. We moved there before, or we made the decision before we had jobs lined up.
Mm,
So I just got lucky. I talked to a bunch of different branding firms in Shanghai, Beijing. We looked at Singapore, which we did eventually go to Singapore, and Hong Kong. And Vladimir, who runs Lab Brand in Shanghai, was nice enough to offer a role, even though he knew my Chinese wasn't that good. And it's exactly, well, it's for two reasons. One is what you said. They have quite a few Western clients looking to get into China. And so I was able to provide, to be a pretty good liaison with some of those, especially American companies, as the only American on that team. And so while my understanding of the Chinese market was not great, obviously when I got there, I learned as quickly as I could. But I was able to play that role of helping explain some of the ideas of what was happening in China or what they needed to do to get into the Chinese market in a way that they might understand as Western sort of with Western business philosophy and things like
mm,
that. The other big part of it was that at the time, Lab Brand was doing Chinese brand naming. They were doing a lot of market research and they were doing some brand strategy, but they didn't really have, I don't think they'd mind me saying this, they didn't really have a robust brand strategy practice with a full team on the ground or anything like that. And so I was hired partly to help them build that out. So I was effectively running brand strategy along with the founding partners while I was there, and eventually hiring local Chinese people and trying to train them into some of the best practices of brand strategy so that they could do that work with local businesses, and so that eventually they would have a real practice there. And I was only there for a little over a year before Future Brand came knocking with an opportunity in Singapore, which is where I went next. And to be honest, I loved Shanghai, but the opportunity in Singapore was one that I felt I couldn't refuse at the time. So my wife and I packed up our lives again and headed to another country.
mm. Well, I've only ever worked in Australia, so we were talking to my wife and I were talking about moving briefly to Bali just to work remotely. I'm not necessarily so I'm a freelancer, full-time freelancing.
Yeah,
So essentially I can do my work from anywhere.
yeah.
At least that was the plan. But this was like maybe Feb this year. So
And then the pandemic hit.
yeah, and then it was just all the plans kind of went out the window. So we're kind
Yeah,
of
it's too
stuck
bad.
here now in Australia and re, re um, thinking the plans there. So I
Yeah.
have there's a quick question that I have, and one that sort of is a good transition to what you were talking about as far as the brand strategy. So I'll ask you the big question first, and then
Mhm.
I'll ask you the smaller question. So why should designers care about brand strategy? That's my big question. My small question is, who is Vladimir, and is he Russian? It sounds like a
Yeah,
Russian
sorry.
name.
I should have explained. It's funny. It was such a multicultural. So I'll answer your small question first.
Yeah.
Vladimir Jurovich heads up Labrand. He started it. He is a Frenchman.
Oh,
Um,
French. Okay.
yes, but his name is, I believe, because of his Serbian roots, and he, as a result of being a Serbian Frenchman living in Shanghai for over a decade, he speaks those three languages fluently, and I think another three as well. So he's a pretty amazing guy who started this company really young and has built it up. And I think they're doing really well still to this day. Um, but to get to your conversation about brand strategy, so I think designers should understand it for a handful of reasons. I believe fundamentally it's going to make them better designers. Just as much as every strategist should understand design. I think this work that we do when we're working with brands is, and part of what I love about it is that it is such a blend of strategy and getting the words right and getting the imagery right. And so um, design, what I call verbal identity, which includes naming and strategy, they all have to be working. And so while each of us may have our own areas of specialty, um, it's really helpful if we invest the time and energy in getting to understand the other parts of it. So I can't design very well at all from scratch, but I like to think that I could look at other people's design work and critique it with some degree of sort of education around what works and why and what doesn't. And I'd like to think that, the best designers that I've worked with are ones that can really engage in the strategy process as well, and um, kind of help steer strategy parts of projects and get in early and potentially head off a strategy that I or somebody else might recommend that really is not easy to implement from a design standpoint. So for all those reasons, I think it's important. I also think clients care about it. And, to the degree, if you're a freelancer, you have clients. And so you want to care about what your clients care about. So that's another reason. And then I also think, the reason a lot of people are probably getting more interested in it is it also probably allows designers to sell their work at higher premiums. If they're thinking strategically and doing more than just churning out logos without much thought behind them, then if they're doing a good job, they should be able to make a bigger impact and therefore charge higher prices as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think well, that was one of the most predominant reasons why some years ago I've kind of transitioned more into trying to do more kind of brand strategy and just that kind of big picture thinking rather than logos. Like I was working, my background, I think about 14 years ago, I was working at the web design agency and we cranked out websites, but then we also had very small clients that would kind of say, well, since you're doing my website, why don't you do my logo as well? And we're like, pretty sure that's not how the correct process, but
yeah,
anyway.
I'm sure they wanted it for free too. Just throw it in for free.
Yeah, just it's a simple thing, right? And then when we used to do logos, and then they would be like, no, my 5-year-old could have done this, and they're like, okay, well, this is, there's no strategy behind this. You haven't really told us anything about your brand. You kind of, so then I started, looking more into strategy and, why should the brand be creating a logo? Is the logo even, necessary, or, how do we go about forming this kind of big idea of our brand rather than just the logo? Because a logo, you recognize quite early. You can create a nice looking logo, but if it doesn't convey any kind of essence of a brand, like it can literally be just picked from Shutterstock. Like an icon can be picked off Shutterstock. They can use it, and I've come across plenty of brands that do that. So yeah, it's the business owners really care about how you can solve the business problem rather than necessarily, creating a pretty looking logo.
Yeah.
So my question is, what's from a naming perspective, when in the process of branding?
Yes.
I mean, I know the answer, but I think some of the audience would like to hear it. Is at what point should you consider naming? So if there's a new client that comes to you, or maybe there's an existing brand that's looking to reposition, at what point do you have a conversation about naming? Or if the naming is on the cards, should you tackle that as the very first thing? Like where in the process of branding does that fall?
Well, I mean, to put it, maybe this is an oversimplified answer, but it should come after the strategy and before the design, especially if you're going to design a logo, because you need, generally speaking, to know what the name is that you're going to put into the logo. So that's the easy answer. I think the harder, or maybe the more important question, though, is the what. Not when do you do the naming, but why are you doing the naming? And so getting a grasp of, if it's something new, then obviously it needs a name. But if you're renaming it, what's the rationale for that renaming? And that might help determine the best timing and the best way to roll out that new name. You said something earlier that I wanted to touch on, to just go back for a second about logo design and visual identity. I think another reason that designers need to understand strategy is, if you're a believer in this whole brand idea that stronger brands build stronger businesses, and there are all kinds of advantages to having a strong brand, and that one of the things that makes a brand stronger is that it's built around a focused idea, and that idea is then brought to life consistently across a whole host of touch points. Those are some of the tenets of brand strategy and brand thinking. And so the reason you therefore need to understand brand strategy is to make sure that what you're designing has meaning, and that it is conveying the intended meaning in a consistent way, so that the words match up with the visuals, and so that the logo is telling the story that the company wants to tell about who it is and why it matters, and who it's for. So really getting to understand all of that stuff. And I think studying what other brands have done really well strategically, not just looking through logo books of, oh, that one looks cool and that one doesn't, but understanding that one worked and that one didn't, and why. Or this one conveys a message and this one is just a pretty shape. Getting to that level of depth, I think, would be really useful for any designer.
Yeah, I think we've got a comment here from Katerina, Miss Marketing. She says there has to be a meaning behind every logo. So kind of the way I look at logo design is obviously, as you said, if you're just designing a logo but there is no strategy, then yes, it can be nicely balanced, but maybe there's no kind of meaning behind it. But I look at the logo where maybe it doesn't have to tell the entire story of your brand, but it's more like at least it should have at least it should open maybe a conversation about the brand, or give a sort of a glimpse of the what the brand is like to deal with, and that can only happen, and you can only do that as a designer if you have that brand strategy in place first. And it actually becomes really easy once you have the brand strategy. I know I've started as more of a designer, and I've kind of transitioned more into the thinking side of things. Mm-hmm. I know this as a designer that it's a lot easier to create a logo or website or any marketing materials when you have that brand strategy in place, because it's like a very clear checklist. You can go back and refer to the brand strategy and you go, does this logo or does this piece of marketing thing answer, or communicate some of these key messages and key kind of essence of the brand? And if it does, then I think it kind of accomplishes that its job. Like, I don't think the logo needs to be a vessel to tell the entire picture, right? It needs to be kind of it needs just to fit in with the overall ecosystem of the brand, I think.
Yeah, I would even go further and say that most likely any logo that tries to tell the entire story is probably going to be overcomplicated and kind of a mess. I mean, maybe there are some that do that more than others, but simplicity is one of the hallmarks, I think, of great logo design. And so maybe not saying everything is a goal. And the same is true of names, by the way. One of the biggest mistakes that companies make if they don't know what they're doing coming up with a name, is they try to pack everything into the name instead of just letting the name, to your point, letting the name be a conversation starter. So it says one important thing, but it just sort of gets you past that first sentence or that first word of the story, and then you have messaging and design and everything else to help you tell the rest of the story. I think that some of the best logos out there, are word marks as well, and so I think we have to acknowledge that. Sometimes it's not really meaning per se, or it's not a substantive story that a logo is trying to tell, but it's just trying to convey a personality or a tone. And so, it's just important to think of the fact or acknowledge the fact that that's another part of brand strategy, is what is the brand personality. And so you might have a mark like Coca-Cola, which doesn't really say anything about the product. It doesn't have any kind of inherent meaning as far as I know, but that script and that color, along with being so incredibly distinctive and consistent over the years, I think does convey a sense of personality that they use consistently through everything else they do. So that's another kind of opportunity for designers to just get a sense of what's the right tone or feeling that we want people to get when they see this.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think it's totally correct. And also in the sense of, as you said, sometimes the logo can be very basic or like almost like a word mark. And a lot of the times that's maybe due to the fact that, say, your brand positioning is saying that, your brand is all about providing the ease of use and being really simple to use. And, it's providing convenience and all of these different things. And then in those cases, just creating a simple word mark makes sense because that in itself kind of conveys this.
Right.
We're not about this mumbo jumbo and kind of complicated things and scripts, and it's just a simple straight up and down, sans serif logo mark or something.
Yeah.
That in itself can convey, like, without even you knowing, it's like subconsciously telling you that this is a very simplistic brand and it cares about, this idealistic world of giving you simplicity and ease of use. And that is kind of a similar thing that this Misaki in the comments is asking. I'm not sure. Misaki SF, maybe San Francisco. Sometimes you give what you have, but still the client don't like it. Do you have to redesign it, or do you have to make him love it? I mean, I'll give you the flow for that one in sacro, but I just think that that we've kind of answered that. We touched on that already. I think from a positioning point of view, I think if you have the client on board with the initial brand strategy and the brand positioning, then kind of selling the logo or making them love it is not so complicated as when you're only giving them the logo with no brand strategy, because they've kind of already bought into the brand strategy process and the whole brand positioning. In essence, it should be easy for them to make the connection and make the link, from what you're giving them in a form of a logo design, to the design, the brand strategy that you've kind of created for them previously.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I was going to kind of leave that one to you, given that I'm not a designer, but there's a good parallel here with naming. And it also ties back to your original question of why should designers care about brand strategy, is that, like you said, it makes the process less subjective. And this is one of the main ways to succeed in naming, is to make it leave as little up to opinion as possible. So instead of showing a bunch of names, or if it is logos, and just saying which one do you like best, if you do that, then everyone's going to have a different opinion, and it's going to be really hard to figure out which one to use. But if you have done the strategy and you've done the briefing, then it's less which one do you like best, and it's more which of these names or which of these logos conveys the meaning that we all agreed we wanted to try to convey. And it's still, it doesn't make it easy necessarily. There's still all kinds of room for debate over, well, I think that one does it because of this, or I think this one does it better. But at least you're having a conversation that's a little bit more grounded, and hopefully it makes everyone feel a little more comfortable that they're having a real conversation instead of just kind of shouting their opinions, and whoever shouts loudest wins.
Yeah, it's not. It becomes less of a personal opinion. And this is true for naming or logo design or any kind of design in general. It becomes more of a conversation of, does this particular logo or name, communicate those things that we did in the brand strategy? You can objectively say yes or no,
Right.
or at least most people. I mean, some people will still have, some sort of an emotional reaction to like a logo or a name that maybe has bad connotations, for example,
Right.
from the personal experiences. But it's still much more objective than just giving them the logo, giving them the name without any context. And then they kind of just go, well, no, it doesn't. I hate red. Like, Jason in the comments was saying something about, they hate red, and they just say, do red. Well, yeah, if you're just doing a logo, then you kind of go, maybe you're having difficulty to explain why red shouldn't be used. But if you have the brand strategy, you might say, well, we're targeting this particular target market, and we're trying to, be conveying safety or something, and then you putting red, and that automatically becomes like a danger kind of color, and
Right.
Automatically you're like your message is the opposite that what you're trying to say. There was another question here. I think let me just have a look. Yes, I think Jason here in the comments, he's answered also from a perspective, I think, of if you don't have a brand strategy and you're still having kind of issues with design, is to ask a lot of questions. And I think that's probably useful. If you don't have a strategy, or if you can't sort of afford, like if the client doesn't is not able to afford the brand strategy necessarily, if you're working with smaller companies and businesses, you can still sort of integrate, I think, some form of strategic thinking in there to try and help guide them.
I mean, I would argue that if you're asking a bunch of questions, you're probably doing brand strategy. You may not be calling it that, but maybe it's just a question of kind of reframing what you're doing. If you're asking a bunch of questions, I mean, that's what brand strategists do at the beginning of the process. We may be a little more systematic about which questions we ask and how we ask them, and how we then take the answers and kind of assimilate or distill that into some kind of strategy. But yeah, if you're doing something quick for a very small budget, or if you're just working for a friend, and there's just not going to be a big full-scale brand strategy phase of a project, you still got to ask those questions, and it's still the same questions. Just it really shouldn't be what colors do you like, because strategically that doesn't make sense necessarily, especially if the person who's running the company or selling the product or whatever it is not the same as the target audience for that. So if you have a 40-year-old friend who's trying to sell clothes to 20-year-olds, then their opinion of what looks good or sounds good probably doesn't matter that much. So part of being a strategist is making sure that you and your client are putting yourselves in the shoes of those customers, and asking the right questions. And then based on those answers, you're going to do naming, potentially you're going to do design, but that's really, on some fundamental level, not to downplay the significance of strategy work, but it kind of is just asking questions and answering.
Yeah. So much to unpack. I'm just trying to process. I think it's definitely something that designers need to think of in general, and I think a lot more designers are doing that now. Back in the day, I think brand strategy probably wasn't such a kind of popular topic, or something that was across, or that many people were across. And I think now there are a lot more people being vocal about brand strategy in general, and I think that's helping to bring awareness to just not just smashing out logos, but rather having a deeper approach and kind of asking questions and making those connections.
Yeah, it seems like there's this real movement of designers, and I don't know how new it is versus how much I'm just kind of how it's sort of new to me. I mean, a lot of this is coming through as I get kind of more deeply into Instagram and some of the different people that I've met, like you, like Jacob Cass over at Just Creative that you mentioned. There seems to be this new breed of younger or young-ish designers who kind of inherently understand at least the importance of strategy, and are investing a lot more time and energy and thinking strategically and trying to be this hybrid strategist designer, or just a designer who thinks strategically, which is incredibly valuable to someone like me who really just does strategy work and doesn't do design, but also to clients. And I mean, I think we probably have to give someone like Marty Neumeier a lot of credit there too, who comes from a design background, but has written some of these really influential strategy, brand strategy books. So I don't know if that's what kind of got the ball rolling, but I do really love seeing on Instagram and elsewhere a lot more of these solopreneur designers or small shops where the designer and the strategists work together really hand in hand, or in some cases are almost indistinguishable from one another because they just both get it. And I think that's, again, back to your very first question, it's like, it's so valuable to have someone that can understand both.
Mm. Yeah. To get back to naming,
Yeah,
because that's the topic that I kind of wanted to talk to the
sure.
most is what what kind of impact do you think naming can have on the business or brand, or can it have impact, and why, or why not?
Yeah, it definitely can have an impact, and I hate to start with a negative, but it's sometimes the easiest way to grasp it is I think we would all acknowledge that it can have a negative impact because we've heard the stories of naming mistakes. In the U.S. there was a company called Trunk. I think you did. Did you have Trunk in your Instagram
Yeah,
post
yeah,
recently? Yeah, so
yes.
that's why it's top of mind for me. I mean that one certainly was kind of a laughing stock. Um, there are these cultural and linguistic disasters. Reebok named a shoe Incubus, and turns out an incubus is like a little demon that does terrible things to women. And so that, I mean, it had a significant financial cost for Reebok. They had to, I guess they didn't, I don't know if they recalled the shoe, but they had to rename the shoe. And so, I mean, that's embarrassing, but also expensive and could slow down sales and have all kinds of impact. So that's the kind of negative case. On the positive side, unfortunately, like so many things with brand, it's really kind of hard to directly attribute the success of a company or a product back to any one thing that you did right, right? I mean, it could
Mm,
be, it's just like asking, does an incredible logo have a big impact? Yeah, I mean, probably. We think it does, but you can't necessarily say 20% of this brand success is due to the fact that we chose that color
mm,
or anything that specific. So I usually frame it as think of the name as an opportunity. Um, so again, it's certainly something where you can make a mistake. And so at the very least, you want to avoid all of the pitfalls in naming. But on the positive side, I think you can think of it as an opportunity um, to start the conversation the way you want to build buzz around something, to educate people a little bit about what this product is, um, to strike an emotional chord. And so whatever it is that you're trying to do with that name, if you do it well, then you get a leg up on your competition. Maybe you don't have to invest as much in other aspects of marketing because you have an incredibly powerful name.
mm. Yeah, it's very difficult, I think, for us creatives in general, is just some of the services that we provide, like especially those kind of really subjective things like a logo or a name, to really put up, I guess, a metric on it to say, yes, we know
Yeah.
100% that having this particular name or having this particular logo is going to achieve this particular bottom line kind of result or something like that. And I think that's what a lot of designers especially struggle with. I think strategists have, like yourself, that you have a bit more of your head around it in the sense of how to frame that to the clients. But I know a lot of designers, especially the ones who are starting out, when things are kind of brought up, maybe in a meeting or something with a client, they have a hard time, explaining that and justifying that. If they say, well, why do I need a logo? Why do I need a name? If you can't show me how, much kind of necessarily value that's going to bring me, from a
One thing
monetary point of view.
that, yeah, it is. It's hard, but one thing that might be helpful that we haven't talked about yet, it might help or it might not, depends on who you're talking to. But I think talking to just the general power of language to influence the way people think. So outside of the context of business, even. But if you look at psychology studies around, if you tell a bunch of people that if you have people watch a video of a car crashing into another car, and if you ask half the people, how fast do you think that car was going when it crashed into the other car, and then you ask the other half of the people, how fast do you think it was going when it bumped into the other car? The group that you said crash to will have a statistically significant higher rating of how fast they think that car was going. So there's studies like that. You can point to things in politics, like I mean, there's all kinds of literature out there around like pro-life versus pro-choice, and how these phrases that different political sides of an argument choose can be so incredibly powerful and swaying.
Mm.
the way people feel about them, and even getting down to like euphemisms for food. So I don't think I'm going to remember off the top of my head, but maybe it's mahi mahi, the fish that we can all order at
Hmm.
restaurants.
Yeah.
I think the original name for that was something like the toothfish, and of course nobody's going to order a toothfish. Um, and again, there are actual studies. Even prunes. They've found that when they stop calling them prunes and start calling them dried plums, even though it's exactly the same thing, and most of us know that prunes are dried plums, sales actually go up because it's just the power of language. So, giving some of those kinds of examples, while it doesn't tell you, unfortunately, there isn't a case study I can point to that says this company named itself this and therefore its revenues went up this amount. It still kind of hopefully gets your clients thinking like, oh yeah, okay, words are important. We need to choose carefully here.
Mm. Yeah, because it's not a study that's where you look at case A, like the company names themselves, blah, like
Yeah,
X, and then another company names like the same exact company names themselves Y, and then you give that like 6 to 12 months period of,
right.
doing the same kind of marketing, and then which ones like, you can't really do that. So
Yeah,
that's
because
the,
in order to do it right, you'd have to actually build that company and that brand, right? And so it
mm,
becomes a pretty expensive proposition to actually build two separate brands and have them out in market for a significant
mm.
amount of time. But I don't know. I mean, I'd love it if somebody tried to do some kind of A/B testing on a brand name and report back what they found. Maybe something like that exists, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's some kind of a control group. Like you have to have something that's, controlled, and then something that where you say you have a very bland name like national security company, or
Right.
something, and
Yeah.
then versus some other creative name that you come up with, and then trying to test that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of, just you were mentioning, about trying to avoid mistakes, and we talked about trunk and how that's kind of had a negative impact, and had a bit of a they had a bit of ridicule that they copped in the media for it, and from just overall from the creative community. Uh, from your experience dealing with small business owners or CEOs and stuff, what have you noticed that the biggest kind of maybe mistakes or um, mindsets that um, like negative mindsets for them to be able to come up with a great name for the business?
There
Some
are a
of the
lot of
downfalls.
Yeah, there are a lot of places that naming can go wrong, which is part of why a lot of what I've written and talked about is about process. I know it sounds really boring, and a lot of us like to think that naming is this um, totally creative exercise where you're ordering a pizza and a six pack of beer and just sitting in a room with friends and putting post-it notes on the wall. And of course, that can be part of the process, and creativity is a huge part of the process. But you got to have some kind of rigor around how you start and how you end, the bookends of that creativity. And so one of the big mistakes, or a few of the big mistakes, are right at the beginning. We talked about briefing a lot, or we talked about strategy, which would then be captured in a naming brief. So just getting the brief right is important, same as for a logo, and kind of the same principles of what makes a good brief. It has to be um, not so loose that you just say like, yeah, call it anything, um, but not so constricting that you feel like you have no room
Mm.
to do anything. And so I think a lot of that comes with experience. When you have an experienced namer, they can look at a brief and say like, oh yeah, I already have some ideas, and you get a sense of, yeah, there's some territory here for me to play in. But so much of naming comes down to the psychology of the people involved in deciding. And so one of the other really important parts is getting the right people involved right at the beginning. So if you have someone that's going to be a decision maker or has veto power over the name, you don't want them to come in right at the end, not have been involved in the process, and just look at a bunch of names and say, I don't get it. I don't like any of them. Or worse yet,
Mm.
look at the creative brief and say, well, this brief is wrong. This is not what the name should express at all. And
Yeah.
so, and I've had all of these things happen. I mean, even those of us who know this, you still, sometimes it just sort of feels like you fall into the same traps as much as you try to manage around them. But so that's one. Um, I think a few more. The two parts of the process that are critical that sometimes less experienced people will skip over are just legal screening and linguistic screening, to the degree that those are relevant for the project, and they almost always are to some degree. Um, you have to know that you can safely use a name in the market before you start using it. And so I've seen big agencies that claim to do naming and present a bunch of names and haven't done any kind of check to see whether anybody else is using them. And that ultimately just hurts the process, because it's almost worse if your client gets excited about those names and then you have to tell them, those 12 names you liked, all 12 of them are unavailable. I mean, that's really demoralizing. Um, and then you asked about mindset. So a couple other things. Thinking that the name's going to jump off the page, that they're going to see a bunch of ideas and that one of them is going to be the answer and that everyone's going to agree on it immediately and the project's going to be over. It just doesn't work that way. It has to be strategic. And like I said earlier, even if it was purely opinion, the idea that all of the client team is going to have the same opinion is unlikely. And also just kind of trying to keep an open mind until the end, because there's always a chance that your lawyers will tell you that you can't use the name that you thought you were going to use. So
Wow.
I've written a little bit about this, and I'm sure I have an Instagram post on it as well. I usually call them the pitfalls of the naming process. So if anybody wants to look that up or anything, I've probably missed a few, but those are some of the big ones.
Yes,
Does that,
great points. Yeah, especially like I've had processes like that where you don't involve the main decision maker at the very beginning, or part of the process. Sometimes there's like a marketing manager, or sometimes some kind of committee that they're trying to sell to, or to the CEO, but they say no, you can't have access to the CEO at the beginning. It's very busy, and he's put us in charge,
exactly.
and he trusts us. So wherever we say,
Yeah.
he's going to go, and then
Yeah.
you deliver the name or the logo or whatever it might be. And yeah, like you've mentioned, he might go, no, I don't get it, or he goes, yeah, like the creative brief to begin with is wrong.
Yeah.
These are not our values. So so
Yep,
I've
I've had
definitely
it. I
had
mean,
this.
I'll give you a little story where I can't name any names, but I was working at a big agency for a big brand, and the client did exactly what you just said. They said, don't worry, my boss is on board with whatever we want to do, and so this is the naming brief, and let's just get started. And I said, okay, but I just have to tell you that I've experienced this before, and we find that it's always best to get that person involved. I know they're busy, and so I kind of laid that all out there, and the client actually was so upset that I had done that I'd second guessed them, that they called my boss and complained and said that Rob is like he's a negative, a negative force on this project, and he's whatever, all this stuff. And so my boss and I kind of, I don't know, laughed about that and thought, okay, all right, well, let's just go. And so we did the naming work. It took weeks. We flew down to where the client was. I was waiting outside to go in and present names. My boss went in to meet with the big boss at the client, shared the brief with him for the first time, and texted my phone and said, the big boss does not agree with the naming brief. And I'm standing there with my presentation ready to go. And I just wrote back like, what do we do? Should we just fly home? I mean, why do we even present these names? And we ultimately did present it. And of course it didn't go well, because he just felt like these names might be great for the brief that you created, but the brief is wrong. So you need to start over, basically. And so it was this weird thing where, even though we knew the pitfalls, even though we explained them to the client, maybe you always second guess. Maybe we should have been more assertive. Maybe I should have used a different tone on the phone when I said this. But sometimes you kind of fall into these same traps. And so I think it's just really useful, and hopefully for everybody listening to this, to just be reminded, even if you know these things or you feel like they're obvious, you just got to keep reminding yourself on every new project to go through those same motions of reminding the client why it's important to go to do it this way and not to do it that way. And, I find myself repeating myself a lot with different clients because I've found that these ideas phrased in this way are effective. And so it works. If
Yeah.
it works, let's keep doing it.
Yes, that's certainly yeah, pretty big things like downfalls you can avoid if you yeah. So, but sometimes in our cases we can't avoid them either, even though we know about them. Like I said, the one of the practices that I started implementing when I was working at the last job at the branding agency, I started implementing a process called reverse briefing. So when so if we had like a discovery session or a brief come in from the client, after that discovery session, we would actually kind of, I guess, interpret the brief in the way that we understand it,
Mm-hmm.
and we would deliver that back to whoever's making the decision. Whether that was the marketing manager, we would still say to them, "Look, this is our reverse brief. Your decision maker has to, agree, green light this particular brief before we kind of get started."
Yeah,
So sometimes, I mean, that's not again, nothing is concrete or a guarantee, but that's
but it helps.
kind of like an additional step where we can say, well, this is how we interpret it. If you agree that we interpreted it correctly, then we can, proceed.
Right. And something that you can do in naming that's similar to that, or maybe even an extra step that I think is a lot easier in naming than like logo or identity design, is what I've heard called either a checkpoint, or some firms call it a trial balloon. I call it just like a reality check on the brief, is to, once you think you have the brief pretty much nailed, to do some naming. And I mentioned the importance of trademark screening and linguistic screening, but before you do any of that, just show your client a couple of ideas and make sure to really carefully couch them, as we're not sharing actual names yet because we haven't done any of that screening, but we just want to run a couple of initial ideas by you to make sure that we're interpreting the brief correctly. And sometimes you learn something by doing that. The example I always give is, there's all kinds of adjectives in a naming brief, right? So the client agrees that the name should be witty, but not silly, or something like that. Well, what is one man's witty is another person's silly. So it's important to test that line and show them a bunch of names that you think are kind of on the border between witty and silly, and get that reality check of, oh, well, actually, these ones that you thought were really silly, we love all of those. And then you kind of know where to go in the full scale name generation. So I like, and you tell the client, some of these are going to be off target on purpose because we're purposely trying to test the limits of that target. And
I think that's kind of the purpose of like a mood board or stylescape from a visual perspective. I think it's kind of has the same mission, I guess, is to try and test the waters, because you don't necessarily always want to go ahead and create this full overarching brand identity, which might take several weeks sometimes. Even though you think positioning is right and what have you, sometimes you still want to give them a bit of a taste of how you've interpreted, and this is the kind of visuals and the kind of colors and the kind of typography and the imagery that we think is going to convey that message. And do I agree? Yes or no? And then we proceed.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's one place where namers have an advantage over designers. In my experience, is that mood boards. I think you're totally right, and I love it when designers use them, but it still leaves a lot open to interpretation. So sometimes, especially if your clients just aren't experienced with design, they may think they love the mood board, but actually they're just keying in on one element of it and not really getting the full picture of the mood board. They're not getting the mood from the mood board. Whereas everyone kind of understands language at some fundamental level. And so if you're showing them 8 letters on a PowerPoint slide, they can read that and have an opinion on it. The downside of that is that I do think designers get a little more respect in terms of like, you're the expert because I can't draw, or whatever it is that clients say, or I'm not a designer. Whereas naming, because everybody that we work with can read and write, they sometimes tend to think, well, I'm just as much of an expert in naming as the next person. So, so why should I listen to you? So it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
I think that's changing a little bit because now we have like tools like Canva, where everyone's
Yeah,
got access to design and everyone's creating their own social media posts, even if they're not a designer in a lot of cases.
right.
Um, and yeah, I've had comments that are the same, whether there was naming or design. They can say, "Oh, well, I'm not a designer, but I think this is shit," or even though they might have said, "You're the designer, so I trust you," but then
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
this is all of these comments again. It was pretty much when before I started doing strategy. Once I've started,
uh,
integrated the strategic processes, I did have negative feedback or comments that maybe this should be changed or this should be something different. But it became less about just subjective opinions about something. It
yeah.
actually became concrete feedback you can actually implement.
Yeah, if I could give one tip on presenting names that what you just said made me think of, because there always is a negative reaction to some of the ideas, and another big difference is I think between naming and typical visual identity design is the number of ideas that's presented.
Mm.
So I'll often present 20 name ideas at once, whereas I doubt that most identity designers are showing 20 fully
No,
blown out logo
no, I've
concepts.
gone to just presenting one, really. I used to
Yeah,
present
exactly.
three, and then I've gone to just to presenting one.
Either way, I think, less is more to some degree, right? You show them too
Mm.
much and but with names, I think you do need to show a number. That's actually something I've learned because I used to show fewer name ideas. I would come into presentations with six or eight. And I think there's a time to do that. It all kind of depends on the context, but generally in the first round of a naming project, I like to show quite a few more. Um, and so because I'm showing that many, even though we've agreed on a brief, I always, when I get to the end, first off, I ask people not to comment on every single one, partly just because it's too many and it'll take too long.
Mm.
Um, but really because I want people to reserve judgment. And so much of this is about the psychology and managing the thought process of the clients as they're looking at names, because looking at name ideas is so unfamiliar to everyone that doesn't do naming for a living,
Mm.
or do branding for a living. So you need to help them kind of figure out the right way to do it. It's almost like maybe teaching someone to critique art or something like that. You just have, or listen to music, you have to like understand how to interpret it. And so when I get to the end and they're looking at maybe all 20 on some sort of summary slide, um, I always say something to the effect of, I showed you a lot of ideas. I know I can guarantee that some of them you do not like, or some of them, if you're more strategic in the way you think about it, some of them you can't work. Maybe I even showed you some that you thought, oh, well, that's our competitor's, subsidiary or something, which, I
Mm.
should have probably caught, but maybe for some reason I didn't. Um, I know that's the case, but I don't want to hear about that yet. The first reaction I want to get out of everyone on the call, so if whether it's just one client or you have six people on a call or in the room with you,
Mm.
post COVID, when we're back in rooms again, I want to just hear which ideas are resonating or could work, even if it's not jumping off the page, but just which ones did you think, oh, that one could work, that's a maybe, or that one feels kind of good. And I go around and have everyone just give their positive feedback first. And a big part of the reason for that is that the second anyone says anything even slightly negative about a name, human psychology is that everybody else sort of becomes afraid to say something positive about it, right? They
Mm.
don't want to defend it, especially it's not their idea, they're they're to some degree afraid of getting humiliated for liking something that everybody else thinks sucks. I mean, I know hopefully most of your clients are more psychologically balanced than that, but still, it's just basic human psychology. If somebody says it stinks, then all of a sudden everyone wants to kind of gang up on that idea. And
Mm.
so I just think that's a really critical thing that honestly I didn't know when I first started doing naming. And now that I do that, it's had a big impact on my ability to get a final name across the finish line, which is often the hardest part. It's not, naming is not just about coming up with cool ideas. That's important, but there are a lot of people that can do that and still can't be good namers. In fact, I was just talking to some people on LinkedIn about the fact that AI is starting to get to the point that it can come up with some pretty cool, interesting, creative name ideas, but it can't sell them to anybody yet and get them to actually accept it. It can't help clients figure out which name is the best one, at least not yet. That's still something that people have to do, and you need some experience to get it done.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting, Rob. It's we're coming up on time now, so we've got a few minutes to go. So I've really enjoyed this chat, and I think this is a great deviation maybe from for some of the designers, especially out there, that they start thinking more about strategy in general and overall kind of brand and business thinking. And if you don't mind, I might upload this to my IGTV in the videos, so then people can refer back to it. Why don't you tell people? I know people can find you on How Brands Are Built on Instagram.
Yep.
And are there any other places that I believe you have a podcast which I haven't checked out yet, but
check it out.
Are there any other places they can find you on?
It's all, a lot of it is around How Brands Are Built, which is a website at howbrandsarebuilt.com. And when you're there, you can find articles as well as the podcast episodes. Or if you just want to hear the podcast, you can find it on Apple or Spotify or Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's also just How Brands Are Built. And then I do have my agency, Heirloom, that I mentioned, which is at heirloomagency.com. And it's got its own social media profiles as well. So I shouldn't be that hard to find. And I would just encourage anyone who's listening and interested to reach out if you have any questions or anything else that I might be able to help out with. And thank you, Ilya, for inviting me to join you today.
My pleasure, Rob. It was great to have you. And we can maybe schedule another chat like this and down the track in the future. So
I hope so.
Thanks for listening to this special episode featuring my conversation with Ilya of Studeo. Don't forget to check out Ilya's Instagram feed at We Are Studeo. That's STUDEO. You can also find him at studeo.com.au, where you'll find links to his other social media profiles, his portfolio, and a few classes he teaches on Skillshare. Thanks again for checking out this special episode of the podcast. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our logo and original podcast artwork is by Joel Sherlow, with additional design work by Lacey Honda. Web development by Matthias Garrido. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time.